A broader perspective now. Timothy Garton Ash is an historian and author. He also teaches at Oxford and Stanford universities. I spoke with him earlier this fall in Toronto. You've argued that Brexit and the crisis in Europe have their roots in 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. How so?
But actually, I think there are a number of connections. For example, the Berlin Wall opened the door to the countries of Eastern Europe becoming democracies, members of the European Union. That meant that their people could move freely across the continent. And actually, East European immigration to Britain was one of the biggest causes for the vote for Brexit. More broadly, it opened the door to globalization. And I think you can see Brexit, the Brexit vote, like Trump and like many of the populist movements, in many ways, as a reaction against the speed and scale of globalization.
You draw the similarities, you touch on that, between Trump supporters, Brexit supporters, and those populist supporters in Europe. What motivates them?
Well, I think that it's partly that people feel they lost from the changes of the last 30 years, most obviously unskilled workers, the old working class, that we know, but it's also that an awful lot of people feel left behind and disoriented by the sheer scale and speed of change. I mean, the fact is, you know, for cosmopolitan, young, intellectual people, immigration, multiculturalism, new technology, this is all great, this is all fantastic. For an awful lot of people, it's just too much change too fast. So the classic populist sentence, populist voter center is, I don't recognize my own country anymore. And I think we liberals, liberal internationalists, failed to think enough about that and actually to bring people with us, bring people along in the changes. So I think the changes were good in themselves, but we did not think enough about those who felt left behind.
Do you think that's changing? Do you think that the liberal intellectuals, as you're talking about, whether that's academic or political, do you think that's changing?
I think that we have a prise de conscience of all liberals, and we should have. And you know, Mark Liller's new books and other new books are saying, what do we do about this? Do I think we've found the answers? Not yet. Because at the end of the day, jobs have been disappearing. They're not those quote-unquote good jobs that they used to be. And that's partly because of globalization, but it's also because of automation. Now we have artificial intelligence coming online. And the question is, actually, we have to rethink the world of work. So I think there's some sort of heavy intellectual labor to be done. And I sometimes say we need a new Keynes to try and reconceive how we think about it.
United States. It used to be that the Democratic Party, and I hesitate to call it left, but the Democratic Party in the United States was the party for workers. That changed, right? And those votes went to Republicans when they felt that the Democratic Party, the more liberal party in the United States, didn't represent them anymore.
This is actually true in Europe too. The Socialist Party in France lost out to Marine Le Pen. Many Labour voters went to Brexit. It's the centre-left that has to think again about what it's offering to the working class, to the extent that that still exists, and people who have done less well from these changes.
What does it need to offer? Do you have ideas?
Well, first of all, I think we have to show that we hear these people, we're taking them seriously, and they are not a bunch of deplorables, a basket of deplorables, yes, to use Hillary Clinton's famous phrase, because that was extremely telling. And if you hear, you know, metropolitan liberals in London talking about the Brexit voters, it has the same feel about it, right? And in many of our societies, we have this cleavage. So we have to take their experience seriously, but then you have to work out how you create new and worthwhile jobs, jobs that give people self-respect as well as a reasonable income, in this incredibly rapidly changing world.
Yes, that none of us really know how, what's coming.
Well,
in a
and
sense.
what it clearly involves is lifetime learning, because the skill set that you come in with as an auto mechanic, now is not going to be the one you need in 20 years' time. I suspect it needs job shares. I think there are all sorts of creative ways of thinking about how you spread the work around and have it make sense.
Mm. Has the tenor of the debate in Britain over Brexit changed?
Definitely, because it's becoming more realistic, thank heaven. And I hope that's not too late, because, as you know, the Brexiteers promised that we could have our cake and eat it. That was the central promise, that we could have all the advantages of belonging to the single market without the obligations and duties of being members of the European Union. And the European Union is saying to the British government, no way.
Right.
You can't have your cake and eat it. Well, obviously, which is we should have known. So it is becoming more realistic. I think there is still just a small chance that Brexit itself will be avoided.
How so?
Because the deal we're going to get is, instead of having our cake and eating it, it's going to be the worst of both worlds. It's going to be the opposite. We're going to have many of the obligations of membership, but it'll be second-class membership of the European Union. We won't be sitting at the table writing the rules that we'll have to abide by. If people wake up to how bad it's going to be for Britain in time, there is nothing in British constitutional tradition to stop Parliament saying we need to think again. And either we have a second referendum or we have an early general election. And again, the key is actually with Labour, because it needs Labour to say, this is a lousy deal, we have to think again.
How likely is that?
Well, unfortunately, I think with Jeremy Corbyn, who in his bones is a Eurosceptic, I think it's rather unlikely. And I think tragically, public opinion is going to shift, but maybe not fast enough. Because after all, we're all human, and it's only human to be reluctant to admit you were wrong until things get very bad. And so I think there's a kind of unfolding tragedy about that it'll be too late by the time public opinion has shifted.
Does the leadership in Europe really care at this point whether Britain leaves?
So this has been really quite shocking. The extent to which Brexit has already happened in the minds of most of the other 27. And their view is, number one, we've got to get on and save the European project. We have our own problems. We can't worry about yours. Number two, we can't give you too good a deal, because otherwise that would encourage others to make for the door. If you can be outside and yet have all the advantages, why stay in? Interestingly, in one opinion poll, only 56% of Italians are definitely in favor of remaining in the European Union, and for that very reason. So, no, Merkel, Macron, they have their own challenges, and they're moving on.
I want to ask a couple of questions about the European project, Brexit or no Brexit. How significant a threat is Putin?
Well, I think that Putin's strategic goal is the disintegration of Europe. He wants to break it apart. And the fact that he's successfully seized Crimea, that he's stirring the pot in eastern Ukraine, has to be taken very seriously. He is interfering in our elections, as also in the American election. There are all sorts of channels of Russian influence. So I think we have to take it very seriously. I don't think in itself, I don't think he's suddenly going to seize the Baltic states. I don't think he's going to split the European Union apart. I don't think that's within his power. But it's one of many forces which, taken together, are threatening the whole European project.
You've also suggested that we should be paying attention to China in the European context.
Well, I would first of all make a broader point, that I think when historians look back in 50 years' time, they will say, what is the big story of the 2000s and the 2010s? It is the rise of China. That's a world historical development. And I think there's a real argument that first with the Middle East, with the Iraq War, and now with Russia, we have 2 decades of strategic distraction from what is actually clearly the central strategic challenge for Europe and for the United States. Most Europeans view China differently from the Americans. America views it as a rival, if not an enemy. Mm-hmm. Europeans see it as an opportunity, on the whole, which it is, a commercial opportunity. But the flip side of that is, if China invests in a number of smaller, poorer EU states, they in effect get a seat at the decision-making table in Brussels.